basically, I'm a fourth generation vet from the UK, although neither of my sons nor daughters have gone down that road. And I started off in general practice, but then finding I wanted to do something, I did this master's in tropical, and since then I've lived and worked in about 23 different countries. From UK and Australia, but we'll talk about some of those as we go through. And I suppose what's become the overriding part of my life, I'm not a specialist in foot and mouth or any of these viruses. I'm somebody who just loves getting in, working with the animals and with the people as well. So I've actually spent a lot of time working in developing countries. Started with the first one in 1979 there, just between Christmas and New Year, which was North Yemen in the days before it was joined to South Yemen. And then I was in Saudi Arabia working with gazelles and oryx in wildlife rehabilitation. Then I worked here with the RSPCA, trying to look at ways of developing a mobile veterinary clinic for oiled wildlife after Saddam Hussein had blown up those all those oil wells in the first Gulf War. I met my wife in Saudi at that stage. She's not a Saudi, she's actually an Australian, but we came to Australia via Mongolia, as you do, and worked there on a horseback expedition for several months up in the north, just living in gers and tents, and then we had an interesting time going to Ethiopia and a few other places before arriving in Australia and taking a job down on the Monero just in the end of the last century in 98. And then after about 4 years there, I got headhunted by MLA to go back to the Middle East and worked with them with live exports for several years. Then I moved on and did consultancies around the world, Africa, South America, and Asia. And then from there, I went to Mongolia and was working there, and then came back to Australia in after 4 years to live and work out of Glen Innes and Inverell, and that's where I am now and speaking to you from there today. So my topic today is foot and mouth disease, and this is what I'm going to talk about. You need to know where I'm going to go. I'm going to that's not a picture of me, by the way. I'm going to look at the animals that are infected and then a worldview, give you some of the history of foot and mouth as I've seen it, and then look at the epidemiology of the disease, the virus, the disease, control mechanisms, and then how, if it were to get here, which at some stage it's going to, how would we ascertain and obtain ourselves freedom, which is what we're going to need. So essentially, I suppose, here's a picture of quite a few of the animals that are affected by it. The ones that we'd be primarily concerned about in this country are sort of at the top end here. These gazelles don't run around in this country, but they were some of the ones I worked with in Saudi. That's a reem, a sand gazelle, and they spread actually all the way across from Saudi, all the way across to Mongolia, which was fascinating. These animals here are major contributors, especially this one here, the Cape buffalo in Africa, because that one's able to carry it and it cycles in those animals. Now, up until this point, you may have seen, well, they're all cloven hoofed animals, but of course, when you look at these ones here, which are all actually quite important in the life cycle, they don't have to cloven hooves. They're not ruminants. So we'll look at that in just a moment. There's one species that can be affected by it. And that's this little joker here, and he's able to A, be infected, and B, potentially spread it, because what happens, and we'll see later with other species that it's the same, is the virus gets into the back of the throat, into the tonsils, and then in coughing, the spume that comes out can carry the virus and then could infect animals. So that's a really critical aspect of the disease that we'll come to. And I suppose if we look at that, as I've said, it's normally the even-toed animals, the ungulates, which are having it. Cloven hoofed, as we can see from the little bottle on the side. But the other animals, don't they have 4 toes? So these are artiodactyls, which are even-toed animals, ungulates. So I put that one up. And just to keep you in a light-hearted mood, to show that these diseases don't have to be serious, I thought I'd put on my viral hat for you, just to make it a little bit more memorable. So foot and mouth disease, probably the most contagious, if not the most contagious, one of the most contagious viral diseases, is what we in the veterinary world call a transboundary disease, because it spreads so easily across the natural boundaries or the unnatural boundaries that mankind has imposed. And if we look at this picture of the world, you can see all these sort of areas encircled are areas where we have what we call different pools of the vaccine. And you can see it stretches all the way across from East Asia, across to South America. And that basically encompasses something like about 77% of the world livestock population. We'll come back to what these pools mean in a moment. But at this point in time, the virus is not contained in the red area of mainland Asia. It's got right through into this part of Indonesia here. So it's pretty close to our northern boundaries at the moment. But you can see, I'm sure, that these areas in red, which are the high endemic areas where the virus is, are the poorer parts of the world. So control, such as it is borne by those lower and lower middle class income countries. If we look at these pictures from North Yemen, 79. This was where I first saw it. I'd come from the sheltered background of UK, although I had indeed been through the 67 outbreak, but it never actually reached our property, which was down south. But here in Yemen, my patch, as it were, for best part of 3 years was in this sort of area down on the Tehama, which is the coastal strip down this western side up against the Red Sea. And across the bottom here, we have what they call the Bab el-Mandeb, which is the closest part to Africa, apart from where it joins up by Sinai. And across here was a known smuggling route. And my role, one of them, was to try and monitor for the arrival of foot and mouth disease or the more severe rinderpest coming across from Africa. So that's Sanaa, the capital, mud bricks, beautiful sort of town. Here's the terraces up in the mountains. These is the natural clothes that people wore. I never actually got as far as wearing a jambia in my belt, although I've got several actually in the frame on the wall behind me. But we used, they used down there, even camels. Here they are crushing the sesame seed oil out, and that big urn is carved out of wood. So the whole of livestock in this part of the world was very agrarian. And the problem was that the virus arose in springtime with the moisture, and the animals went down with diseases, the foot and mouth disease, ulcers on the feet, in the tongues. They couldn't eat. They went down. I'll show some pictures of the signs a bit later on. But that meant that when it came to putting in the seeds, there were virtually no animals left to pull the plough. So this is the sort of thing that happened, was that the men would use their wives to pull the plough instead. And that was a common sight. If we look at those signs of foot and mouth disease, here's the animals down underneath the trees trying to get it up, but they've got sores like this on the feet. They've got sores in the mouth, in the tongue, on the palate, on the lips. Means they don't eat. They're very, very painful because these sores aren't that deep into the tissues. And anybody that's worn new shoes will know that that worst blister is when it just catches the end of the nerves. And that's a very superficial blister. Deeper and deeper, there's less nerve endings, so it's not actually quite so painful. It's the end of the nerve. So this would become infected where these blisters were here. So the animals, they'd be losing a lot of saliva, dehydrating, not able to move to water, not able to move to food. And that's why it was so problematical. And these poverty-stricken people, and there's no doubt about it, they were even then, long before the Gulf War, when the value of their real deteriorated 10, 12 times the price that it was against the Saudi real, means that they have no ability to control. They don't have a culling policy. They just try to nurse animals through so that they will get better. By contrast, in England, here we are, UK, 1967 and 2001 outbreaks. I was actually working in Bombala when this second outbreak at CAP happened, so I took time without pay, went back to help the mother country. They actually stationed me down in the West Country in Devon, which was one of the worst affected areas, although it was more extensive up in the north. And of course, the control methods there were culling, no animals hovering in the background that had survived. There was mass slaughter of these animals, followed by movement, destruction of the carcasses to try and prevent the virus from spreading. And this was achieved by funeral pyres that could be seen from miles and miles away. It takes a lot of material to burn animals. I'm not going to give you the figures, but it is, believe me, it is an awful lot of material to keep the intensity of heat there that is needed. The control centres around the UK, this little map here, strangely enough, is not the UK foot and mouth established control centres. These are the aerodromes from World War II, but these were widely used as control centres. Here's a picture from World War II, and this, where one of my pals went to up here in the northern part of the country, is the self-same bunker, and that's the state that it was at. This is where I was located, further south in a typical ministry bunker. So if we look at the effects from 2001, there were 2,000 cases during the 9-month period. This little graph in the bottom shows the first one coming, and I'll go through the timescale in a moment, but through from March through to the end of October. And for those students of COVID, this looks very similar, with a massive peak, then trying to control it, but not being able to get rid of this tail. And this is the critical aspect of this virus disease, as many other virus diseases. So there were over 6 million slaughtered animals during that period. And although the sums are accurate, at times they were up to 93,000 head per week. And the estimated cost of that epidemic, that outbreak, was £8 billion sterling. it affected public life in so many ways. Primarily, I suppose, the pictures such as this and the fires that were daily bread and butter to the media. But also, there was massive closure of footpaths, pubs. When you drove along the countryside, you weren't allowed to get out. So everywhere, everybody was impinged by the essence of the disease and what was happening. Crufts, the dog show, was closed. Cheltenham races was closed. Rugby union matches were cancelled. Even general elections were postponed. And before you cheer, they held them again a bit later. And there's often suggestions that the reason they postponed it was that the opposition was hoping that people would get so fed up that with the control mechanisms that they'd get in on the back of it, but they didn't. Tourism was decimated. The British rally, for instance, was cancelled, and that was one of the big, long-lasting effects that went on. So here's a timeline for that outbreak. Started in February. On the 19th, they picked up this suspicious disease in Worley Abattoir, which is in Essex, which is down here, this little yellow area. But there were also cases, or animals, I should say, down here that had come from Northumberland, up here, Bucks, just down here, and the Isle of Wight, which is that little island off the bottom there. Not saying they were all infected, but that's where animals had come from, which shows you, to a certain extent, the movement patterns around the British Isles that subsequently led to such widespread distribution. So initially, then, on the 20th of February, they put in an 8-kilometre radius movement restrictions around this abattoir. But on the 21st, the EU banned all exports, or well, they banned the imports from UK in its entirety. And on the 23rd of February, heading on the wall, and this little picture of what appears to be grassland is actually just outside Heading on the Wall, and you can just see Hadrian's Wall there, right beside it, and the little fossa that runs alongside that. And this chap, whose name I've written in black because he's such an evil character, Bobby War, he was making swill, which he wasn't cooking properly. It was illegal in those days to make swill and not cook it properly. And he was using Asian meat products in the swill, which had come in illegally into the country. And that was where the major focus of these animals had come from. So some of his animals had apparently come from up here down to Essex, and then it had spread in the slaughterhouse. So on February the 23rd, that's 4 days later, there was a national stock standstill. But by the next day, not because of the standstill, but despite the standstill, it was in Devon, this red area here, North Wales, this area through here. And by March, it had reached Cornwall, a little green bit down the end where I used to live, right near the tip there. Southern Scotland up through here, and the Lake District, which is this sort of red area, the top of this red area through here. Just to throw a spanner in the works, of course, they had a rail crash in Yorkshire through here. And of course, that made it really difficult because they were trying to get rescuers and investigators into this area in the middle of the outbreak. The last case was in the 29th of November. And on January 2002, the country was declared free. Of course, if you look at this map of France and these other countries here, Holland and so forth, there had been spread through. And out of the picture, it's actually believed that there was in the 67 outbreak, the virus had spread from an outbreak in the very south of France and had arrived up into this area through here from the south of France and had been spread by wind and not by meat products. And what had happened, the analysis goes, is that the virus went high into the stratosphere, caught on one of those aerial currents, whizzed along up there until it came down. And that was only found in retrospect when they could find the different subtypes of the virus and where they were in the world at the time that the UK outbreak started. So as you can imagine, there was a lot of public reaction in UK at the time. And I suppose from our perspective, my perspective and the concern of governments here, a lot of that public reaction was against the slaughter policy. Arguments were made against environmental pollution, both burial, which was widely used, and the burning. And then it went on against livestock farming in general. Now, this calf, you may think, why am I putting this calf here? This is Phoenix, found underneath the carcasses of other animals on a property, and was bottle fed by the son of the owners. And Phoenix became a symbol of hope. And so there was a lot of media coverage while the government agonized over whether this animal should be put down. It had come from a farm where apparently there had been virus infection, but in fact, although it was repeatedly tested, it did not ever show positive. But it engendered such phrases as this, which, you know, one of those great memorable phrases that we will all remember, I'm sure. So, have we had it in Australia, this foot and mouth virus? Yes, we have. 1801, 1804, and at least 4 incursions in 1871-72. The Werribee in Victoria outbreak of 1872 is especially interesting. A bull, Ahmed, was imported on a ship called the Northumberland on February the 29th. Now, you may or may not remember that Northumberland was where that fellow in black, Mr. War, no relation to the cricketers, lived. So I find it very nice little coincidence that the Northumberland was the vessel on which this bull Ahmed was supposed to have arrived. It arrived in Victoria, was moved around the countryside for several days before it was identified, or diagnosed is perhaps the better word, as being infected with foot and mouth disease. This lovely little paper, why did it become established for 88, is actually very interesting from a veterinary perspective, because it actually suggests that in fact they may not have had foot and mouth disease, but a different virus. It's certainly well recognized that some of these other outbreaks, which were undoubtedly foot and mouth disease, were actually in remote areas of the countryside. And please, I'm not using this to say that this is Australia. This actually happens to be a picture from the United States, but there were too many animals in the picture for my needs. But if the animals were thin on the ground, the virus might not be able to get a hold because there would be no close animals to spread. And if the wind was blowing in the wrong direction, it might not meet up with animals. And so for that reason, the virus never established. However, nowadays, 800,000 tons of meat from animals which could be affected are sold overseas. So 70% of that's beef, 95% mutton, and 65% of that is lamb. So if within 4 days the EU is banning it from from the UK, the similar sort of thing is going to happen to all our meat, with bans around the world from all our income, including potentially stuff that's already on the high seas or being sold by plane. Before I go into any more details, let me just briefly run through the epidemiology of foot and mouth and diseases in general. It's a triangle with three primary aspects to it. One is the agent that's involved, which in this case is the foot and mouth agent, and there are indeed a mix of different strains. Then there is the population, and these are the susceptible animals, the number of individuals in that population. So in other words, are they extensively grazed in dry areas, or are they intensively housed in feedlots, or what's their resistance, either natural or required? And although of less importance with this disease, what's their nutritional status and the breed and the age and the sex? I say that because the virus is such that in Australia we would have no natural resistance. The animals would therefore have minimal resistance to it, whether they were thin or fat, and regardless of their age or sex. Although the age may have a little bit of bearing on the signs that we saw, but I'll come to that in a moment. The environment is going to be not only the climate, but also the socio-political environment of the time. And that will also reflect some of the things like the feral species that may be affected and introduce the germ to an area, carriers of the disease, boundaries which might stop movement, livestock movement, quarantine. And again, although the environment might make some difference, the soil is not going to be so critical. The temperatures in between, because we'll see that the virus is reasonably resistant to some of the temperatures, but the warmer it gets, the less it is resistant, and it's more easily denatured. So that's altogether, we use all the factors that we're talking about in risk management when it comes to looking at how we can control this virus. So here we are. Can't give teachers a lecture without going through a bit of kingdom, phylum, and so forth. So this is the definition of the foot and mouth disease virus. It's an athovirus, which is in the CQUniversity family. Pretty tiny. Pico is 1/1,000,000th, 10 to the minus 12. That little picture is AFA is a little blister in there, and I put a piccolo just to remind you that it's pretty damn small. But when I look at Picorna, Pico is small, RNA, and viridi. I've got that RNA strand because that is critical to the life cycle of the virus. There's the picture of the virus. This one happens to be in blue, but you can see why I'm wearing the hat that I am wearing. And these features are all important. So the virus was first identified in 1897 by that fellow there. Tiny little virus. It's icosahedral. We all know that means it's got 20 sides to the protein capsid, but no protective envelope around it. And it has single-stranded RNA genome. So here's the genome in green, surrounded by this icosahedral protein capsid. So the virus binds to the receptor site of the epithelium, usually, as I say, in the back of the throat. There it enters the cells and the capsid, the shell, dissolves. The RNA replicates, and then the cell's ribosomes turn it back into viral proteins. So intracellular assembly of the viral NNA and the capsid protein produces new viruses. The host cell bursts open, releases that virus into the blood, and voila, you've got a viremia where it spreads around the whole body. Simple as that. Now, do you remember I said there are several strains? AOC South Africa type 1, South Africa type 2, South Africa type 3, and Asia 1. We look at now at these little pools, we can see that there are different strains in each of these pools. And they are not fixed because one of the things that happens is during that RNA multiplication, the RNA can break and reform. Now, if you've got different strains or substrains of the virus in an infection, you can get yet a new variation of these virus substrains reforming. So you're constantly getting a change of what viruses you have in your particular outbreak. And this is of especial import when it comes to the vaccines, because although there is some cross immunity between these strains, it's not very good. So if we're here and we get infected by pool 1 in Australia, which has OA and Asian 1, we have to have a vaccine which contains will stimulate immunity against OA and Asia 1. There's no point in having one that's made in South Africa, for instance, which has got OA, SAT 1, 2, and 3, because it's just not going to do the job that we want. Or it's going to have SAT 1, 2, and 3, and we've got none of those in the outbreak that we're likely to have. So that's a really critical aspect of the vaccine or the use of vaccines. For various legal reasons, because we're free of it, and we don't want an outbreak in Australia that's caused by escape of vaccine from a lab, like they had in the UK in 2004, for instance. They have the World Reference Laboratory at Pirbright, and that, the #1 facility, had a leak which caused an outbreak nearby that was totally preventable, except that there's always the risk of something going wrong. Here's some characteristics. You can read your teachers. I'm not going to tell you read all this out, but just what I wanted to show you is that this one here at 12 hours at this pH, but 1 second at this pH. So it's pretty stable at this range of pH. But look at that pH of a lemon is 2, just to give you sort of reference point. Sunlight, UV, has little effect. Relative humidity is important. So if we've got hot summer situations, we get less than 60% relative humidity, we get rapid deactivation. And do you remember how I said in Yemen and many other countries, the disease would happen in springtime when the spring rains came, the humidity is up, the virus survives. So the virus can survive in dirt, straw, feces, etc., for several weeks. And that is a crucial aspect when it comes to control and hygiene. How does it spread? Through the mouth, through breathing. It can actually be spread through reproduction, through AI, etc. And it can be spread through wounds, so into the feet if they're paddling around in infection. There are no insect vectors as such, although insects, birds, and other animals can physically carry it even if they're not infected themselves. So the infection period between 2 and 14 days, and that's the period between infection and when they'll show signs. So you could have a period of nearly 2 weeks when the animal is spewing out the virus, but is not actually showing any outward signs. So in Australia, the morbidity would be 100%, almost certainly. You wouldn't get any natural resistance. In countries where they've had it, like Yemen, like Mongolia, where we saw it, there would be some resistance still left, so the morbidity would be lower. Mortality, generally low in adults, 1 to 5%. That's pretty low, mortality rate for animals. But in young animals, it could be 20% or higher. And that's often caused by heart lesions, which we've got here. Here's a whole raft of signs. So the animals can be just dull and show a slight temperature, but the virus is in the secretions and excretions, all these bits and bobs. And it could be 4 days before the signs are seen. So we've talked about how that viremia occurs. And these areas here are where the ulcers occur. Now, the pig is interesting, because the pig is a much more potent multiplier of the virus than our other species, 1 to 3,000 times more than, let's say, a cattle. These blisters, they will heal, all other things being equal, within 7 days. Could be a bit longer if there's secondary bacterial infection. For those animals that have got it, it lowers their growth. There's depression of milk yield and chronic ill thrift, especially if they've had, young animals have had heart lesions, but they don't recover completely. So this is one reason why we don't want it in, is that it will lead to this happening all the time consistently in the country. Now, I've talked about what foot and mouth is. There are some differential diagnoses. So those are diseases which we have to rule out. Hand, foot and mouth disease, which children get, is a Coxsackie virus. It is not the same as foot and mouth disease. It is not the same as virus. The last known case in the Western world was 1967 outbreak in the UK, where somebody got foot and mouth disease and they isolated the virus from the disease that he got. But in general, most people just carry it for a few days, don't show any signs. So it's actually been taken off the list of zoonoses. But I'm sure that in some of these other countries, there are people who just don't even see a doctor for it. There are the exotic diseases that can mimic it. Swine vesicular disease, vesicular stomatitis, vesicular exanthema, and pestipity ruminal, nasties that we don't want. So just if we pick those up, we don't want those either. Rinderpest is interesting. That was the #1 disease I was looking for in Yemen. It's a horrible disease. It causes about 96% mortality in adult animals. It's in fact been eradicated from the world now, second viral disease after smallpox that we've eradicated. But let's hope that nobody's got a vial of rinderpest virus hidden away in some lab somewhere. Then, of course, the more normal things we find are, oh my God, lesions. Ovine mouth and gum obscure disease, which was identified after the 2001, I think it was actually after the 67 outbreak, where they did surveys and found all these lesions in sheep's mouths that looked as if they might be ulcers of foot and mouth disease, because the sheep and goats do not show quite the same violent reactions to ulceration and the sickness and the lameness that cattle do. So there are those ones. And then there's this bovine malignant catarrhal fever, known in South Africa as Zika, or however they pronounce it out there. Looks very similar. We get that one in Australia. I've diagnosed it several times. Fatal, but usually only one animal at a time. We do get a touch of blue tongue, doesn't usually cause signs. We get pestivirus, and the really severe form causes massive ulcers in the mouth. IBR, that's a respiratory disease, can also mimic the same signs as foot and mouth disease. Scabby mouth is less likely to, but it can. And then there are these sort of non-specific diseases that can come in lots of different ways and present depending on the circumstances, the moisture, etc., etc. And these are the differentials that vets will never mind getting called out for if ever you think that you've got it. So what's Australia's foot and mouth policy? It's category 2 degrees under the government livestock cost sharing deed. And that means that cost has already been agreed that government will pay 80% and industry will pay 20% of the associated fees, costs, etc., etc. We will eradicate foot and mouth disease in the shortest possible time while minimizing the economic impact using stamping out supported by a combination of strategies. So that's it in a nutshell. The principles are laid down in what we call AusVet Plan, an already created document on, and there's a separate plan for each of the major exotic diseases that we might face, and these are constantly reviewed. You can read there, as I can, all those. I've just selected those from the AusVet Plan. I just tap in AusVet Plan and you'll go to the site with Animal Health Australia and you can have a read. But basically we want to keep it out. And the critical thing, if it gets here, somebody please use the EAD hotline as soon as possible. It's there 24/7. And then we want a visual inspection by somebody that's seen it, and laboratory testing of fresh PME tissues, post-mortem tissues, blood, and even fluids from the blisters. So we then need to stop the spread. So we stop livestock movements immediately, carcass disposal and disinfection, and then we put in various barriers and control zones. So here's our EAD hotline. Who should do any of this stuff? And so I've taken a quote from the New South Wales Biosecurity Act of 2015, which basically puts the responsibility on anybody who knows or ought reasonably to know the biosecurity risk posed by the disease. So that's, dare I say, teachers in schools, vets, producers, slaughterhouse people, carriers, etc. You take your photographs, send them off, because if you ring this number, they'll say, have you got any photographs? And then they'll tell you who to send it to. The penalties for not doing are severe. And nowadays, as we know, with tracebacks on things like COVID, we can get pretty accurate as to where cases were and have been. So please don't let yourselves get caught up in that. If it's suspicious, you contact the emergency animal disease. And here are the 5 things that might make you think foot and mouth. Acute lameness in a group of animals, excess salivation, vesicles in the mouth, on the feet and or the teats, fever, and a considerable drop in milk yield. So we'd be thinking there the dairy species. Those are the things that you need to keep focused in your mind. Here's a poster produced by the Americans out of Plum Island, which shows the lesions. Again, this one's healing. The ear's really nasty. These pigs would be really lame with that, and that would be a predominating sign with them. This soreness here could get masked in a slurry of a dairy. You might not pick this one up. You should see that one if you're a dairyman. And these animals will be off food. The arrival in Australia in 1872, this sort of ship maybe, long time to get here, chance for everybody to see what's happening. Nowadays, arrival is in this method, and that brings viruses very, very quickly into the country. The Northern Islands, or the islands to the north of mainland Australia, are a high risk. There's still a lot of boat travel. trade of pigs, pig products, milk, dairy products coming across could well be a source of problem for us. We've already mentioned the wind and then the arrival where there's dense animal population. We've mentioned meat and milk products, dairy products. That's where the virus gets to as a result of that viremia. And these then get sent around the world in post, in parcels, commercially on boats and planes. They come in hand luggage. They come in private yachts and fishing vessels. At this end, if there's poor biosecurity awareness with people who have developed a lifetime of what I would call weak habits from living in other countries, they don't follow up. They try to bring stuff into this country, even if they live here, because they can't think that it'll do any harm. Why would it cause any harm? So here's that swill. Illegal, but happens in small backyards. Maybe they don't cook it up. Maybe they toss it out for the pigs, for the chooks, and the pigs come along and eat it, right? And especially if there's a traditional heritage of feeding waste scraps to pigs to keep the production cycle going. Waste tips up and down the country should be properly fenced and the contents covered by soil, especially for pigs. And with the spread of pigs, they will eat all sorts of stuff, as we know, including scavenging tips. And many's the waste tip that I visited where they're not properly fenced. These viruses can be spread on what we call fomites, so that's your shoes, clothes, hands. And while you might think that only applies to this country, travelers going around in free-range countries in Southeast Asia, they think, oh, I'm not going on a farm, therefore I'm not going to meet up with it. But you look at these barley cattle just wandering around where travelers have wandered in their boots, and they come back home, they fly back home on a Friday night, decide to go for a walk in the fresh air to overcome jet lag on the Saturday morning, spreading that virus wherever they go, potentially for feral pigs, for feral deer, even some sheep and cattle. So we monitor these things, the wind, by having a massive sentinel herds, which are routinely blood tested here. They're also monitored up in the islands as well. And we have border security at our ports, post offices, etc. I mean, you probably all watch that border control more often than I have, but we have sniffer dogs, and we do PCR, so that's laboratory testing for fragments of the virus in samples that are detained. We also assist our neighbours. So recently, Australia has given 4 million vaccine doses to Indonesia to try and reduce the likelihood of the virus being in herds in this part of the world, which is closest to us. The AusVet plan is based on requirements for the OIE, that's the World Animal Health Organization Terrestrial Code. That requires the stoppage of spread and stock standstill. Eradicating the virus is by these means. The creation of zones is written within this OIE terrestrial code. And these are some of the views of things that will go on. And I'll come through to vaccines in a moment, but here's some burial that's going on. But here's the very first thing that will happen, which will be a national stock standstill of all livestock movements until we find out just where the outbreak is located, centered, how widely it is distributed. So these animals on these trucks will be held in a myriad of different locations, like feedlots if they're not full, so they won't be able to go to slaughterhouses, through to sale yards, through to a whole load of different locations that have been identified as being suitable for holding these animals. But of course, depending on the time of year, there will need to be made arrangements for feed possibly to be delivered. So it's not as simple as saying that these animals have to stop. So on-farm biosecurity, you need to learn about the disease before it arrives. It's far too late, and I'm glad you're here because you're getting a chance to learn some of this stuff. Think about border security, perimeter fences and gates, and disinfection on and off properties. These should be involved with all diseases, not just foot and mouth. All of them, we need early detection, but nothing more so than foot and mouth. And so with that way, you reduce and stop farm visitors immediately. There's a stock standstill. You reduce your off-farm activities. So people weren't going to the pub for a drink. There was a major cessation, as I said, of social activities in the rural areas when the foot and mouth was about. And then we've got disinfection of vehicles and people on and off the premises. Here's a quick diagram, I don't intend to dwell on it, but how different areas are mapped and identified. And these are constantly changing as new infected premises are identified. The social and economic effects could be actually ginormous, but they can be financial and mental problems. 80 billion over 10 years for Australia for an outbreak of the similar magnitude to the UK one in 2021, and all these aspects of the black dog in rural Australia. The vaccines. I've loosely discussed the vaccines, but the protection does not last lifelong. It's 6 months maximum. We need to get the right vaccine. There is a delay in the animals developing immunity, and we will get carrier animals that will be carrying the virus in their bodies, even if they are vaccinated. To get freedom once again, it will take longer if we use vaccines, because the tests can't distinguish between antibodies from field virus, that's the one that's caused the disease, or the vaccine. So 6 months if we do go down the road of using a vaccine. Then, of course, we need to consider the feral animals, the pigs, the deer, the goats, whether they have become carriers, and what are our movement controls in Australia. And if we've stopped trade with partners for months, they'll have found other sources of food. And so we will have to struggle to regain those markets. So here's a reminder of those signs. Never so bad in sheep and goats. Here's one here just to see how much less severe it is than here or here. And my take-home message is to protect your assets. Learn about it before it arrives. Spread the word to colleagues, staff, and students. Expect the unexpected. If you see anything unusual, take a photo or video, ring DAF Queensland or the emergency disease hotline, which is that number there. I put down the DAF number because this is University of Central Queensland. But my advice is that if you seriously think it is, don't go home and look at your own animals. Stay on site. Advise everyone not to leave until somebody else could come along and give you the advice you need. So my final picture is to protect your assets. Thank you very much indeed. I'm not in the official circles now. I used to work for New South Wales government with local land services. I'm not now. And I think that's really kind of difficult. The media jumps on announcements from other countries and they find somebody that will say, oh, geez, yes, that's closer. So the risk is increased because it's closer. but it's quite possible that, so I think it is a question of if, of when, not if, but I don't think that we can turn around and say that just because it's there, it is inevitable that it's going to happen. A lot of these diseases, similar to foot and mouth, can get quite close to other countries and never spread. I think any vet would not wish to be the vet who misses that first diagnosis or to find it appearing in his patch or her patch because they hadn't got a good rapport with their clients, or in my case, the ratepayers of an area. I actually have never had a call out in Australia to foot and mouth. I did get a call out to a pest disease in cotton on a Sunday night at 6 o'clock. And they actually named the germ, and I went straight away. Didn't know what one cotton bug from another, but took the picture, sent it to one of my colleagues who did, and they said, no, that's a common one. So, but Anna was satisfied all the way around. And I hope I never do get called out to it, but yes, I mean, when I saw the rinderpest in North Yemen, and it was in the middle of a foot and mouth outbreak, I remember. And I got called to come and see some foot and mouth, and I found 28 out of 32 dead cattle on the floor, and the vultures from Africa were just soaring around the sky and had landed on the carcasses. Absolutely phenomenal sort of sight and smell, to be honest, in that heat. But you remember those things. But because up until that, we hadn't had rinderpest in North Yemen for good many years, and we'd hoped that the vaccine we were doing would keep it out, but it didn't. But there's another tale for another lecture. So the difficulty is that, yes, you can treat. So I think I suggested that the death rate is probably less than 20%. And if we give fluid therapy, to keep the levels of fluid up in the body, if we stop the secondary infections, and we're lucky that we don't get fatal heart problems, then yes, the animals will recover. But the problem is a significant number of those will remain as carriers. They will then have the virus in the body, and if they get run down, they could contaminate other animals later in the season. They will carry antibodies for a longer period of time, and that will confuse the diagnosis. And the basis of international trade for meat and dairy products will be the absence of antibodies, which we won't get if the virus is circulating either in our domestic animals or indeed in the feral species. Will they recover to 100%? The verdict, or the version that I've heard, is that in fact they're never as good as they were before. But that's potentially relative one to the other. I think the risk of trying to treat and save individual animals is far outweighed by the cost of doing so and the risk to the industry and the country as a whole. The essence of it is to have a farm biosecurity plan which is already in place, which you can upgrade the moment somebody hits the red button. You can upgrade it because everybody's always anticipating it. And the immediate thing is immediate cessation of all entrance in. so that nobody other than the people that are feeding animals goes in, and that those people don't go between their own home animals at home or anybody else's animals and the animals at the school. And I think that's the critical issue. It's just taking your normal farm plan to the ultimate level of just protecting them as much as possible, and being aware that if you have learned what the signs of the disease are, at the first sign, you can call on somebody who can give you a more professional opinion than you may have yourself. And the government services, I know, would be delighted to have a recognition amongst the industry in all its facets that their time and effort in training and extension activities is paying dividends by getting a lot of different calls from people saying, oh, this could be, or this could not be. Going on to the list as we find more and more subtle differences between the different differentials that cause a set sign, where as people around the world are moving to live in new areas, take new industries in disturbing habitats, we are getting more spread into humans from those germs, that's for want of a word, that are normally cycling within wildlife populations, but gradually they're being spread over by modern transport, by people going on holiday, by changes in environment where people and animals are looking for somewhere to live that is more suitable than the place they're living at the moment. So I think there's no doubt about it that we're finding new diseases. No, I think if we get foot and mouth, then I think you actually stop everything instantly and just minimize any contact with those animals other than checking them religiously to see whether they get it. If it's a suspect in your area, you probably wouldn't hear about it until it was confirmed that it was or wasn't foot and mouth disease, and therefore then you would know exactly what to do. I think I don't know if that answers that question quite correctly, but if the foot and mouth is in your area, just shut up shop. You do not want to mess around with that at all. If I could, when I went to the UK, I diagnosed it, not the first farm I went to, but relatively soon after arriving there. And it meant that I was not allowed to go on to any more farms to identify whether they had foot and mouth or not, because I could carry that germ with me and potentially carry the infection. So I then had to move sideways. And because I understood the lingo in that part of the country, whereas a lot of the vets that had come in were from France, Germany, Spain, the people in Devon couldn't understand their language, their English, because of the accents. So they put me onto that, which was fine. It was a heart-wrenching job to do that to people who'd lost everything. But it was the risk of spreading it myself that meant it was standard policy not to do that. It wasn't just me choosing, it was standard policy.